to CharityVillage Connects. Today we're exploring the potential impacts of Bill S-216 on the nonprofit sector and how the proposed bill could change the way charities are able to work with frontline community groups that don't have charitable status. Joining me today is Kris Archie, the Chief Executive Officer of the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada. Welcome, Kris.
Hello. Well, thanks for having me.
I wonder if we could just start with the basics and introduce for our listeners to the work that you are doing at the Circle.
Well, the Circle is a national nonprofit organization that is member based, meaning that we have members who are essentially committed to working, thinking, and doing differently in their relationship between settlers in Canada and Indigenous communities, grassroots movements, organizations, and nations. And the particular space that we occupy is what we call being philanthropic adjacent. We are an organization that provides both technical and relational skill building to our member base. And our member base has two primary audiences, what we call the settler philanthropic charitable sector, community foundations, family foundations, corporate foundations, etc. And the other member base are Indigenous organizations, both those that are charitable, non-qualified donee organizations, and grassroots movements, as well as individual nations. And the ultimate goal for the work that we do is to see an increased redistribution of wealth from settler philanthropy into the hands and the decision making of Indigenous organizations, nations, and movements for the good work that they're doing, not only for the benefit of their own communities, but for the benefit of all.
And so, because of the work that you do, that it's clear that you would be directly impacted by the effects of Bill S-216 should it pass. What benefits do you see in bringing to Indigenous communities and Indigenous-led organizations? Can you explain how it would change things?
Broadly, your listeners are probably aware of the fact that the Canada Revenue Agency has a deciding factor when it comes to identifying and giving the okay so that an organization can become a registered charity. There's a list of ways in which they have to demonstrate that their activities are charitable, that they have charitable objects in the work that they're going to do. And it additionally requires them to have a level of transparency and openness to the work that they're doing, and to demonstrate to their members or to the public about the good that they're doing through submitting T3010 information, etc. So here's one of the things I think is very important for folks to understand about the relationship between some Indigenous organizations and or the folks who are doing good work in Indigenous communities and registered charitable status. One of the indicators of being a charitable organization is that you must have a balanced approach to advocacy. Of course, there are limitations on political engagement for charitable organizations, and broadly, we know that many organizations aren't using the fullest ability to do that work up to its 10%. I think nationally it sits around 1% of folks record doing political activities. But this is important because when organizations such as a community in central BC that's trying to do land protection work, if they were to try and request charitable status for protecting land from external forces related to resource extraction, you can probably guess that they're not going to receive charitable status. So charitable status, I think, makes a lot of sense when we want to ensure increased transparency and a knowing about the good work that's happening. And when folks are being given charitable tax breaks because of this good work, accountability is important. However, when the folks who are making the decisions about what's charitable and or not have a direct relationship to a government that is deeply engaged in causing harm related to what Indigenous communities are facing and fighting against and acting against, it's set up from the get-go to not be an equitable system. Meaning many organizations, Indigenous organizations, are doing fantastic work, but because of the work that they're doing, because they're talking about human rights actualizations, that they're protecting the land, that they're reestablishing and asserting their control over their territories, over their education, over their children, their youth, and their families, they're quite likely to be denied charitable status, which means ultimately You have a charitable sector in this country that I don't think is an accurate reflection of the good work that's happening, that's being led by and for Indigenous communities. But it also means that the philanthropic sector is undeniably underfunding the good work of Indigenous communities in this country. So, all that to say, why this conversation about Bill S216 is important. This is an important conversation for Indigenous organizations who, for all kinds of reasons, have decided not to pursue charitable status. As I said, we're talking about lots of reasons why they would be denied, anyways. But there's this other designation that folks get really excited about, and it's called the qualified donee status. However, if you read the language, qualified donee status would require an Indigenous community or effectively a nation to agree that they behave like a municipality. We know that municipalities are different than nations, and we know that there are many Indigenous communities and nations that would never agree to submitting that kind of agreement in order to gain access to philanthropic dollars. But nonetheless, qualified donee status can be a really helpful thing for communities who recognize it's one of their only ways, their only pathways to gain access to settler philanthropic dollars in this country. What's interesting about Bill S216 is it actually does away with that particular requirement. And I think that's a very helpful one when it comes to supporting Indigenous communities and the work that they're doing. It doesn't require them to cede the power and the rights that they have by indicating that they behave like a municipality. And there's a lot of history related to the qualified donee relationship to communities, to Indigenous communities in particular. Um, not necessarily needing to go into all of that here. But I think that this is a very easy way for um, the charitable sector to build a case for supporting and doing away with some very clearly discriminatory language and practice in the Income Tax Act that could have pretty fantastic benefit for Indigenous communities who um, for many years have been leading in fantastic charitable work across this country for decades. Prime example would be friendship centers. They have over 100 friendship centers across this country from coast to coast to coast. I think about 85% of them are led by Indigenous women. Majority of them own their buildings where they exist and provide services. Um, their national body is not a registered charitable entity because of the level of advocacy they do on behalf of these charitable organizations. Many of these organizations were leading way before social enterprise was a thing that got super sexy. These are organizations who recognized very early on they could not count on philanthropic dollars or federal or provincial government support to deliver services to urban Indigenous populations. So they had to start setting up other ways to create money. Some of them own parking lots, others have gift shops, others yet have catering and event planning businesses attached to them. So all that to say, the value of Bill S216, seeing folks rally behind it, is one very easy way to help remove discriminatory language and practice from the Income Tax Act that is, by and large, leaving out a huge and an important group of individuals and organizations doing good work that supports Indigenous communities, but also makes the social fabric of this country better.
So I think the kind of language that you're talking about is the direction and control sort of language in the Income Tax Act that seems to create, and this is according to the senator Omidvar, who is a sponsor of the bill, to create something that is really akin to neocolonialism in the sense of it being a circumstance where you have to be agree to comply and be under the control of the registered charity in order to receive the funds under the present rules. Is that the kind of language that you're referring to that's part of the problem?
I would say yes and no. I mean, so this conversation about S216 is much larger than direction and control. That being said, the specific language of direction and control and the way in which it has to be enacted is very paternalistic, and largely, I think, could be undone in ways that are more helpful, not only to the charitable organization that's serving as the intermediary to flow funds through to a non-qualified or a non-charitable organization or an entity to do good work. Um, but I think that the other piece that just needs to be said is that organizations all across this country are already doing this. They're already in relationships, in partnerships, whereby they are supposed to have a level of oversight and control and to direct the activities of organizations that they're flowing funding through to. And for all kinds of reasons, that is not only unreasonable or not possible because of the lack of cultural context and or because the very specific nature of the work that an organization is doing that an intermediary could never do on its own would just make that a relationship that's fraught with a lot of difficulties. Now, doing away with that language, I think, doesn't just magically make everything better, but it does invite a different kind of a conversation about what does partnership mean? When an organization is choosing to support as an intermediary an Indigenous organization, I think that it provides Indigenous organizations with a little bit more ownership over the work that they're doing. They can say things like, I'm not going to allow you to take photos from our programming and to share it with your donors to gain donor dollars. In fact, the reports that we have that are the reports of elders' stories around a particular piece of land or a particular cultural practice, we're not going to share those with you because they're cultural knowledge that belongs in the community, not to an intermediary organization who needs to prove that good work was happening. So I think those are a couple of examples of where the notion of direction and control provides organizations with the ability to make a request of intellectual property and other kinds of property out of those projects and take ownership or lay claim to those behaviors. And that in and of itself is a practice that we can do without.
Um, I want to actually draw your attention to an article from 2021 that gave data suggesting that Indigenous-led organizations received only 0.05, that's 0.5% of funds given out by charities in 2018. You alluded to this certainly, but can you speak to this reality? And in your mind, is Bill S-216 likely to make a big difference in that? What else needs to be done for the sector to prioritize giving to Indigenous organizations and communities?
So that particular piece of work was done um, in 2021 with a group of actors who were actually building upon work that the Circle had done twice over. So in 2014 and in 2017, the Circle used a T3010 data scrape to understand what amount of dollars from the philanthropic sector were going to at that time, the language was Aboriginal, so either First Nations, Métis, or Inuit community organizations and charitable organizations. The first two iterations of that report found that less than 1% was going to organizations that for based on the T3010 data, had indicated that they have some level of relationship to serve Indigenous peoples. The problem with that data, and this is again a bigger problem about the T3010, is that it doesn't collect accurate enough data to tell the proper picture. Now, if we were to look at that 1% or the most recent piece of research that had been done, which is 0.5%, what we'll discover is largely that those are not what we call Indigenous-led organizations. So the Circle has just recently put out another a tool, a resource that we call the I4DM, that is a definitional matrix that indicates the difference between an Indigenous-led organization along a spectrum to organizations that have Indigenous beneficiaries. This is important for us because we believe ultimately that Indigenous programming, service delivery, advocacy, research, it should be led by Indigenous organizations. And so we have this tool that helps organizations understand what that means. It asks questions about the leadership of the organization, about the cultural practices and the protocols. It also invites reflection about reciprocity. How is the relationship of benefit to Indigenous led organizations? And this is important because ultimately, when an organization's filling out the T3010, they can check a whole range of boxes about who they serve. We know that if you serve a couple of folks who identify as Indigenous, you can check that box. And so the reason, of course, that charitable organizations might decide to check those boxes is because charitable organizations are fundraising. They need to find dollars, and the best way to do that is to indicate that you serve a broad range of individuals in the communities that you're active in. That being said, there's all kinds of reasons why, especially in urban settings, that non-Indigenous-led organizations are providing services to Indigenous peoples. But we stand very clear that Indigenous-led service delivery organizations and programming is the best solution to support Indigenous peoples. So, um, does does 216 on its own mean more money for Indigenous organizations? Heck no. And we know that, right? So let's be very clear about this. Organizations who already have the interest, the ability, and the desire to give to Indigenous groups, whether they are qualified donees, charitable, or grassroots organizations, they're already doing it. And I have a growing member list of settler philanthropic organizations who are very dedicated to thinking and doing differently and who are absolutely funding Indigenous led work all across this country. So, will it make a huge difference to folks who aren't already paying attention to Indigenous organizations and issues and not funding it? Probably not. However, what could be very interesting, and this is in part building on some fantastic work by Jonas Hassan over at the Justice Fund and a range of other actors in this space, there are a couple of ways that this could be really an interesting thing tied into as well the disbursement quota increase. It could make a really big difference if organizations would agree that if they were going to particularly support non qualified donees or rethink their relationship to direction and control, but only in relationship to equity seeking organizations who we all know have a more difficult time accessing dollars from the philanthropic sector writ large. I think that could be a really interesting notion. That's a way that organizations could demonstrate a commitment to equity, is to say, you know what, we're really going to focus in on providing supports, this particular kinds of supports and relationships to equity serving organizations. So that could mean Indigenous led organizations. It could also mean Muslim led, queer led, Black led organizations. And we think that that's a benefit to equity seeking groups. That being said, ultimately, Bill 216, I think, in many ways, provides an opportunity for aspirational behavior. I'm not a fan of policy that's only there to hold at bay the fear of what could go wrong. I'm interested in policy that focuses on what could be possible. I'm interested in policy that says, oh, I hadn't thought about that. Maybe it's something we could do. I'm interested in policy that invites people to think about how they might do their work differently. And so the real magic, the real thing that matters is like what will be the language of implementation around Bill S216. Um, I think I think there's a lot more conversation that needs to be had with organizations. Sadly, I don't think there are many Indigenous leaders who are part of the conversations that matter around the implementation language, and that can be rectified. I'm happy to get a phone call from folks who are in those conversations. Would love to be there. And also just to suggest a range of other Indigenous leaders who I think would have a lot to say and offer to how to make this of benefit. But ultimately, I think that this is a bill that provides an aspirational stance in a sector that is scrambling for easier ways to demonstrate a commitment to equity.
That's a really interesting insight onto this. I do think it's something that I hadn't heard, maybe you could do a little deeper dive in what you mean by aspirational giving and what that represents.
So I'll provide an example from some of the work we're doing at the Circle. So in 2015, the philanthropic sector created a declaration for action that essentially said that recognize, although they weren't explicitly named in the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, they recognized as a sector they had a role to play in helping breathe life into those 94 calls to action. And they said, we're committed to doing something. We're going to learn and remember, acknowledge and act. We're going to take this seriously, and put some heft of the philanthropic sector behind this important work. One of the things that we've been working on over the last couple of years is a very particular tool called the L4A, which stands for the Learning for Action tool. Now, this is a series of questions that are both required for individuals and for organizations to answer that help us as the circle understand what is the journey that these organizations are on as they seek to fulfill the philanthropic declaration for action. What we discovered is that as we created this list of questions that we were really curious about, that we wanted to know who was doing what we discovered as we built out that set of questions is that many charitable organizations, I should be clear, many philanthropic organizations are not necessarily collecting the data to help tell us the story about the good work they're doing, let alone help us track and understand the work they're not doing. So we created a year-long peer-based learning opportunity called the Partners in Reciprocity, whereby teams of folks from settler philanthropic organizations journey over the course of a year to build skill sets and capacities to have tougher conversations, to acknowledge the ways that white supremacy shows up in their organizations, and ultimately give them the ability to answer the questions in the Learning for Action tool. There are questions there that no one's asking on a T3010. We're asking what percentage of your percentage of your annual giving goes to Indigenous-led charitable organizations versus Indigenous benefiting organizations? That requires an organization to do their internal analysis. It requires of them to do what is rightfully their administrative burden to make sense of the information that comes in through them that they can share and make explicit for organizations like my own who can do a level of advocacy. So the reason I talk about this piece is because there's a lack of data that helps me as a leader for a national Indigenous organization talk about the experience of Indigenous movements and nations and charitable organizations, because the systemic structures at play have never recognized a value for asking questions that help me make better decisions, that help me advocate on behalf of our members. We don't have the political clout of larger, older, mostly white-led charitable organizations to knock on the door of the right folks in Ottawa to say, hey, this is really important. We need to know this information. I think the other key piece around why telling the story is important is that the sector wants to do better, but you can't do better without knowing what's happening currently. And so enabling organizations to gain access to data helps us drive different levels of advocacy. But at the end of the day, when I talk about aspiration, we know that there are many questions on the Learning for Action tool that our members are not going to be able to answer the first time they see them, because they need to be very strategic about who in their organization even has the ability to make a decision to collect the data, and then who in the organization has the bandwidth and the analysis to make sense of the data. Additionally, one of the things that drives us at the circle is we're less about having the answers and more about having the questions, because it's moving through answering of the questions by the organizations who actually write their rules, who make a decision about the policies, the practices, and the funding envelopes annually. It's the experience of moving through those conversations, making a case for why these things matter, that can be very helpful. So, why is it important to think about aspirational policy? Because when we ask it questions, people start to think about what else could be possible. and when we think more creatively about what could be possible, we're not mired down in the stories of what could go wrong. So I believe that the charitable sector in this country is incredibly creative and incredibly generous. And I think we need the permission to continue being bold and audacious. However, if we are creating the kinds of policies that are limited by the worries of what ifs, overly concerned about what could go wrong, we are ultimately not only limiting the sector's innovation, we are limiting the possibility for service to folks across this country. And I think that that would be incredibly sad.
Thank you for that explanation. It's so very helpful. I wanted to shift gears a little bit now and talk about the circle. And I understand that the circle has shifted away from the idea of reconciliation in favor of reciprocity. Can you explain why that shift is important, and what you mean by making that shift?
Yeah. Um, well, I mean, even in the question, it's an indication to the notion that reconciliation is an idea. It's not an action and a behavior. And in fact, that's part of the problem. So, um, reconciliation is language that in the social context of the time of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission made a lot of sense. It was indicative of a lot of consideration. And having worked with one of the original commissioners in the design and the development of some of the national gatherings, there was a real sense of possibility around the language of reconciliation. However, what was very, very important was that um, reconciliation wasn't possible without truth telling and truth listening. And what we saw after the 94 calls to action were released was that folks were really quick to jump to this notion of reconciliation, predominantly settler communities, right? We're like, okay, now we know, let's move on. Let's build good relationships. Let's like have a good time. Let us find ways to connect. And sadly, and I actually keep it right here, two documents that I keep right by my desk and refer to quite often. This is a little book put out by the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and it has all the calls to action. What's really wild about the 94 calls to action is that there are kind of two sections to the calls, and people forget this. The whole first part is about addressing the colonial legacy of that harm. And the last half then is framed towards reconciliation. These are numbered. They're in order. That wasn't like, oh, let's just throw them in there. Let's do it alphabetically. No, no, no. These were prioritized. They have numbers for a reason. So people really thought about the notion of like towards reconciliation, let's focus there. But all of the work around addressing the legacy, especially in key sectors like child welfare, like education, like the justice system, that was skipped over. It was too heavy, it was too much. Very quickly, the language of reconciliation, we call the rhetoric of reconciliation, was washed down and very quickly centered the needs, the desires, and the interests of white folks and their desire to reconcile with this painful history. It was no longer centering the voices, the lived experience, and myself as an intergenerational survivor. It was no longer centering our lived experiences, the experiences of the survivors, in the world that we still live in under the Indian Act that still causes harm to this day. When I started at the Circle in 2017, there was increasing calls, predominantly by Indigenous young people, that reconciliation as a word, as a behavior, had been co-opted, and in fact was causing more harm than good. There was more and more analysis about how the language of reconciliation had been picked up by government and by corporations and others to help sell an idea of their goodness rather than demonstrate action and change behavior. In the spring of 2018, we gathered a group of 50 folks from across Canada, and we went to Clowquiet territory, which is on the west coast of Vancouver Island in New Channel speaking territory. And one night we had a conversation there in this multi-day training and relationship building program about reconciliation. And it was very clear that reconciliation was not, as it was currently conceived of, was not going to be possible because it was really centering again settler folks. So then we started to ask the question, we're like, well, what is possible? What else could be possible? And specifically, what else is possible in the space between settler philanthropy and Indigenous organizations? And what came through was this really, what I think, incredibly generous invitation, which was true reconciliation led by settlers is not actually what Indigenous communities want, need, or are interested in. Indigenous communities want and need and are interested in the things that they care about, that are accountable to their communities, that is connected to their lands and to their territories, to their languages and their cultural practices. And what settler philanthropy could do is actually to behave in a less transactional way with them and be invited into a more reciprocal relationship. And that reciprocal relationship would be one that requires of settlers to be willing to transform their behavior, to transform their limited thinking, and to consider how they are complicit in ongoing harm. So it was that conversation and the conversations that unfolded that then forced me, or it wasn't forcing, it really just solidified for me the importance of no longer using the language, the word of reconciliation, because it had become this catch-all for things that we couldn't quite put our finger on. And I was like, that's enough. And so we actually started to do different kinds of work to explore the relationship between organizations and to give and support Indigenous organizations to reframe and to consider what a relationship from their space of power could look like and feel like with Indigenous or with settler philanthropy. And by and large, what they said was settler philanthropic organizations need to do a heck of a lot more learning so that we are able to be in a space of power and well being in a relationship to the philanthropic sector. So basically, our mandate was you all, this is your work circle. Go and do what you can to help create. Changed behavior in settler philanthropy, and then when we show up to partner with them, we know that there's a bit of trust through association with the circle. That this is an organization that's done some work. They've done some internal thinking. They have some serious commitments. So here's the thing about reciprocity, because we are very intentional about the language we use. And when people have an experience of language that moves them, they want to pick it up and carry it around and then use it. However, I have very clear cultural teachings about what it means to be in a reciprocal relationship, and many other Indigenous communities do as well. They have an awareness of what it means to be in deep relationship over a period of time that acknowledges the variety of generosity that is required to be in a reciprocal relationship. Now, folks are starting to use the language of reciprocity as the new partnership. Let's build a partnership. And again, with no power, with no analysis of the power asymmetry, with no real fundamental change to the practices and policies of a settler philanthropic institution, you're just co opting language and doing the same old thing. So when we talk about reciprocity, we're talking about a deep investment in relationship. We're also talking about organizations being willing to demonstrate a commitment to deep learning and unlearning that is led by Indigenous organizations and individuals, not led by their own, voracious curiosity about Indigenous peoples and worldviews. It also means that they have to be willing to really think and do things differently and recognize that the burden of behavior change is not about helping Indigenous organizations be better grant writers. It's about acknowledging that the burden, the administrative burden for the labor to undo some of this harm exists inside of their own organizations. They have grant application writers, they have grant adjudicators, and there's an investment in the supportive learning that they can undertake to be in a different quality of relationship as well. Here's the other thing. Um, Not every philanthropic organization is going to get to a place of reciprocal relations with a community or an organization, and I think that's okay. And in fact, that's kind of the preference. Um, I know for myself, I've got a handful of fantastic relationships to funders who I have a fantastic connection with, and I'm very thankful for their support. Um, but we're really clear with them. We're not interested in being a partner with you if all you want to do is show up to our things and be a voyeur in what it is that we're doing. Um, and so I think there's a recognition that there's a reset time that's required. And some of that reset is going to require that settler philanthropy actually just says, you know what, we see that you're doing good work. We may not understand it because we don't have the cultural context to understand it, but we see that you're here, you're doing good work, you have a relationship of accountability to your community. We're going to fund you to do that good work. And you go ahead and do that good work. We're going to fund it abundantly, and we're going to do our own work. We're going to look at our grant strategies. We're going to look at our application processes. We're going to grapple with the power asymmetry that we are complicit in upholding. We're going to take our board through some deep learning and our leadership, et cetera. And when all of that is said and done, maybe you can come back and be actually a better partner, a better, a better relationship broker. But what's happening right now is that there are organizations who are using the language of reconciliation or reciprocity to build a relationship with Indigenous organizations whereby they're saying, here's some money. Oh, and hey, can you teach us? Can you teach us how to be better? Can we, we're going to fund you, but also, can we have our board members come to your land camp? Can we see the way that the kids are playing on the land? Like, can we come on the fishing trip with you? Like, there's all of this continued extraction that exists when actually the most generous and reciprocal thing to do is to say, this money of settler philanthropy has been built on the lands and the backs of Indigenous peoples, and the very least that we can do is abundantly fund your good work. And maybe when we've done our own work internally, we can enter into a relationship of reciprocity. And I actually think that there are a growing number of organizations who are doing that work. They're doing their own internal work while continuing to fund abundantly Indigenous-led organizations and movements. And I look forward to the day that more folks are doing that. And so, there are organizations out there who are like, well, we don't fund or care about or are interested in Indigenous organizations. That's fine. But let me tell you, somewhere, somehow in your charitable work, you're going to want to support marginalized or equity seeking communities. And I think that there's lessons that can be learned about how we are inviting people into that relationship that can be applied in the behaviors of other equity seeking relationships.
It's my understanding that the circle does engage with nonprofit organizations on reconciliation audits and other educational programming. What would you suggest to an organization that's looking to get started on this journey? And now I won't even call it a reconciliation journey. It's a totally different journey, as you stated. Um, you know, if what how do they start their own education and their own internal audits, and and what would you recommend to these organizations across Canada that many of them do want to have this journey? Um, what would your recommendations be to them?
Great. Well, this is a great reminder that, in fact, there's some language on our website that needs to just be updated. We put down that we would be open to fee-for-service work related to reconciliation audits, but what we discovered after having many conversations with organizations is they weren't actually interested in an audit of how they were doing their work. They wanted an affirmation that what they were doing was good enough. So we've never embarked on that work. And instead have given them a bunch of questions to go back and ask themselves, and then we don't hear from them again, and that's fine. They're probably doing their good work and grappling with some hefty questions. That being said, we do a range of convening work that is largely focused on dialogic practices for how we build relationships through listening and understanding and building new ideas together, sense making together. Organizations who want to get started, there are websites and movies and books galore. Unlike the likes of what we've ever seen, you can listen to podcasts, you can listen to music, you can talk to your grandchildren about it. If you've got any high school kids in your life, any nibblings, they probably have a fantastic array of wisdom about the history of Canada that you can learn more about. So being in conversation is more accessible, especially if you can take the time to learn from young people in your life about what they're seeing and what their experience of the history of Canada is. So that's one way to get started. But ultimately, our invitation to organizations is around this framing. Um, One of the first invitations that organizations can make who want to get started on this journey is first to figure out how you can invest in the people who work where you are. So, is there an investment in the training, in the learning of staff inside of an organization, of board members, of volunteers to help understand the issues related to colonization, issues to racism and systemic injustice in this country? So start first with the people who you already are surrounded by and make sure that there is an investment in who they are and how they can learn more about the true history of this country. um, but also recognize that if you are looking around your organization and it's filled predominantly with people who look the same, who talk the same, who speak the same language with a similar educational background and lived experience, that you need to rethink what level of comfort your workplace is for folks who come from traditionally marginalized communities. So that's one thing, people. The next is kind of they're knotted together, which is practice and policy. Take a look at and understand the ways in which your practices and policies are maintaining the status quo in a way that actually prohibits deepened relationship and or the engagement by equity-seeking communities. Do you have a policy that requires that a $5,000 grant, means 15 pages of an application? Do you have policies that mean that you're unable to pay honoraria, but you want lived experience wisdom in your grant adjudication, but you're not willing to acknowledge that lived wisdom with, childcare support or transit tickets or a meal when they're doing all of this important, rigorous reading and decision making? So practice and policy are really key. Understand the ways in which your institution directly writes and upholds systems of harm in that work, and be willing to analyze how you can come away from that. The fourth is place. You need to be in a right relationship to place, not just like where's our office, but where did our wealth originate? In what place did our wealth originate? In what places is our current investment for our endowments causing harm to various places around the world? How might we be in a relationship to place that says the most important community in our relationships are not donors, they're actually the people who are in need of services because they don't have the wealth that possibly your donors have to live a good life. And so it's reorganizing the thinking and the behavior around place, not only just geographically, but culturally, understanding the places that you exist in, where your wealth has been created, but also how you might build or repair relationship to place where the wealth has caused harm. And the fifth, which is none of the other things matter unless you can also bring an analysis for power to doing this work differently. So folks might listen to that and go, "Well, that's just way too much. I'm not possibly going to be able to do that. So we'll just not do it." My invitation here is very simple. Choose one of them. Choose one and start thinking about how you can rethink a relationship to investing in the people who are doing this work, to interrogating practices and policies that might prohibit quality relationship building. Um, be willing to build a different relationship to place and invest in quality analysis building wisdom about how power exists in a Western in a Western world, and also be willing to invest in understanding different types of power that exist in the world. That actually, when I think about broadly in this world as an Indigenous woman, my kind of value is very little. And I actually am at a very high rate for harm in the medical system, in the justice system, just walking around in the world. In my home community, as an eldest daughter of a community that is matrilineal, I hold a lot of power. I hold a lot of responsibility and I hold a lot of relationship. And I have a high sense of understanding my my kind of spiritual, my psychosocial power. And what tends to happen is in these places where power is so concentrated in a Western world, is that um, our understanding and analysis about power is so limiting, and it's so sad because then we miss out on all these possible ways for increasing, upholding, and supporting different kinds of power and leadership in communities. So um, that's what I would have to say about that.
Uh, yes. Okay. Well, that's really, really helpful. It's also really profound as well. And I don't even know how to actually direct this question now. I'd like to know your feelings about this because I had a question about the National Truth and Reconciliation Day and how non-Indigenous organizations can support it. And I don't know now from our conversation today whether you even like this idea of having a National Truth and Reconciliation Day. What are your thoughts around that?
First and foremost, I'll say that the desire for a day to mark truth and reconciliation comes from survivors, and so I'm absolutely in support. Do I recognize that I think the federal government tried to use it as a good news story during a very bad news reality moment? Yes, that's harmful. However, I know many survivors who are really touched by knowing that this was a day that was being marked to honor and acknowledge their reality. That being said, non-Indigenous organizations can do a few things. First of all, stop asking your Indigenous staff to educate their peers and or your donors and fellow organizations on that day. Give them a paid day off. Give them a couple, actually, because this is not a day of celebration and learning. For me, that day was a day of mourning. It was a day of recognizing the kind of loss of cultural medicine and magic, the beauty of people who did not make it home. It's a day of mourning for me. So definitely give Indigenous staff the time off with pay so that they can be with their family or be with their grief, however it is that it shows up, or they can be in the celebration of the family members who have made it home. What they should be, another thing, I mean, it's connected to this other campaign called One Day's Pay, but here's another thing, and it connects back to some of our earlier conversations. So lots of folks know about the Orange Shirt Society, Orange Shirt Day, right? That is a prime example of an organization that was denied charitable status because their work was not deemed as recognizably charitable. How wild is that? Knowing what we know now about how undeniable the value of their education work is, that they are denied charitable status, which means if anyone wants to give money to them, they can't get a receipt. So we have been on a bit of a campaign to support Canadians to understand the value of non-receivable donations. Because really, unless you're giving, a larger amount of giving, the tax benefit to a lower income earner is very low. However, if you've got a few bucks here or there, we highly recommend you give to non-charitable organizations, to non-receivable organizations. There's some reason why they haven't received their charitable status, and largely it's probably because they're fighting against atrocities and or harms that are being upheld by their provinces or the government, federally or otherwise. What folks should be doing year round is not waiting until June to think about Indigenous peoples in their community. What they could be doing year round is abundantly funding Indigenous-led organizations. They can be engaging in, education with their boards and their teams all year round. Um, but additionally, they could be taking the time to understand how to support the education of their donors. I think charitable organizations who want to do fundraisers or show support for Indigenous organizations should find ways to do it, so that they are taking on the administrative burden of how to make that happen. Many organizations that we connected with last year were just flooded with a barrage of requests for speaking engagements, for, hey, can you help us? Or we want to help you. Can we show up and volunteer? And all of these requests were taking away from Indigenous peoples and their organizations' time to just be present with the reality of Orange Shirt Day. Um, and so, if you want to build relationships with Indigenous organizations, that is a year round activity. And it's also important to recognize that if you don't hear from an organization, probably you don't have enough relationship to make the request that you made, or the request that you made is of no interest. And so, move along. I think that that's something that's very tough for funders to hear sometimes is like, well, but how come they didn't get back to us? Like, we're a funder, we want to give them money. And it's like, you know what? Sometimes folks are not even interested in the money you want to give them because the ask that you have is a demonstration of your lack of awareness or intention for the work that's happening. So I do just want to take a moment to talk about One Day's Pay campaign, which was a settler-led piece of work that we were invited to participate in. It was in recognition that there were many folks across the country who would, because of the National Truth and Reconciliation Day, would receive stat pay. And this one fellow said, that doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like that I should, just benefit from this day and move on. And so Josh came up with the idea that perhaps he could galvanize individuals to give a day's pay. And so we worked with them to create profiles of a few Indigenous organizations so that folks could give directly. Of course, two of the three were non-receivable organizations for exactly the reasons we talked about earlier. But we also created an engagement tool so that individuals who wanted to give, we gave them a little bit of learning. So learn about how which Indigenous organizations are in your neighborhood or in your community. Identify ways to understand and learn about what the realities of Indigenous peoples are, and give directly. So we're really big fans of giving local and giving directly. Um, and so would really just invite people to keep their eyes and ears open when we launch the campaign again. We would love to see more and more organizations think about how to support this campaign, and ultimately, increase awareness as well about why giving to non-charitable organizations is really valuable, especially in the Indigenous movement space. Um, yeah.
Well, your example about the orange shirt example is a perfect example in connection to what we were discussing earlier. I really appreciate you bringing that to light. Um, I'd love to know some advice from you about how organizations can become more involved with the circle's work. Certainly, the One Day Pay initiative is a wonderful initiative, and happy to share that with our audience. But what else can organizations do to become more supportive and involved in the work that you do at the circle?
Well, always we welcome settler philanthropic institutions to become members, and there is a fee for that membership, but there is also an accountability mechanism which says you can't just pay the money and disappear. You pay the money and you have to show up. So we do a variety of convening events that are open to members and non-members, so folks could sign up for our newsletter, follow us on Twitter, take a look at our website, at the-circle.ca to learn more about the work that we're doing and the events and collaborations that they could participate in. We invite folks to take a look at the Indigenous members that we have and to learn more about them, to amplify their amazing work, and to fund them abundantly, however you can. Additionally, if there are organizations who are currently grappling with how to give money and you're wanting some wisdom, some grant advice wisdom, we're open for that and we don't charge. So if you're thinking, I want to really give to Indigenous organizations focused on recreation or outdoor play, We're a shop that you can turn to, and we offer that guidance to philanthropic organizations for free, because it is of most benefit to Indigenous organizations. And that's why we exist, to see more funds flow into the hands of Indigenous organizations and the good work that they're doing.
Well, thank you, Kris, for your wisdom and leadership and the insights into Bill S216 and its potential impact on the nonprofit sector and Indigenous communities across Canada. Your particular perspective is extremely important, and it's most helpful for nonprofits to really hear your views. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.